You expect vacation to be relaxing. Sun, bad drinks, a tan line you swear you'll fix next year. What you don't expect is someone else treating your room like their own, standing in the doorway with a backpack that isn't theirs, and you sitting on a screened porch pretending the wind is the only thing moving. That line between away from home and not safe is thinner than you think. I learned that the hard way, more than once. I'm going to tell you about 3 vacations that didn't go the way postcards promised. One was a house in Maine that looked like it came straight out of a Stephen King prologue. Another was a night in West Palm Beach that ended with a sound I still hear when I close my eyes. And the last one involves a guy I met at a gas station and a condo door left ajar. These are true. They're messy. I wasn't exactly brave in all of them. If anything, I was reckless, stupid, or both, and I carry the if only with me. If you like unsettling travel stories, subscribe for more. I promise there are worse things coming in the next few minutes. The first one happened when I was 18. I was that age where every decision feels bold because you haven't yet learned the cost. My family rented this old place on the coast of Maine, a white clapboard house with green shutters, a porch that sagged on one side, and a wood-burning stove that ate more firewood than sense. My dad loved it. Quiet, ocean smell, the kind of place where you could pretend you read more books than you actually did. My little brother Jake was 10, which meant he spent the mornings building forts out of driftwood and the afternoons inventing ways to get under my feet. I was there because my parents wanted family time. I was there because my girlfriend at the time thought it was cute. Mostly I was there because it was summer, and everything felt like a story I could tell later. Next door was a tiny house that belonged to a man named Hugh. He was local, small-town eccentric, the kind of neighbor who mowed his lawn at odd hours and had a plant collection like it was his religion. He wore suspenders even when it was too hot for it, and he laughed in a way that made you feel like you were sharing a private joke you weren't invited to. We spoke a couple times, polite, short conversations at the fence, and since my parents were friendly, Hugh would sometimes poke his head over and call out that there were spare lobsters left over if anyone wanted them. The house sat a little lower than ours, closer to the scrubby trees that broke into the woods. It had a narrow hallway that led to a back bedroom facing the sea. Someone had propped the bedroom door with a little wooden chair when they needed extra privacy. It was the kind of detail you think is quaint in a movie, and ominous in real life. The day I stayed behind, everyone else went into town for a late lunch. I remember the exact reason. I wanted to text my girlfriend. Pretty pathetic, I know, in hindsight. I had my phone, my earbuds, the kind of music that sounded like it understood my mood even if it didn't. I told my parents I was fine, that Jake and I would chill. But then I wandered over to Hugh's yard because I was bored in a way that felt dangerous and thrilling. Hugh was in his workshop when I poked my head in. He laughed and held up some jar of something pickled that he swore was best in the county. He had a camcorder on a shelf, one of those old-school things, and he joked about using it to catch raccoons. I didn't think much of it, because when you're 18 and being silly with neighbors feels like a plot twist you control. That evening I went back into our house to charge my phone, and for the hell of it, walked through the little side door that used to creak. Inside was the kind of quiet that felt like ears. You could hear every settling board, every distant gull. I ended up standing with my palm on the door to Hugh's house, which happened to be slightly ajar. Curiosity is a stupid muscle. I pushed it open, stepped in on the pretense of visiting my neighbor, and nearly walked straight into Hugh himself. He was in his living room, squinting at some photographs, or maybe it was the light. He looked at me, and for a second there was that laugh again, the one where his mouth starts and his eyes finish. He asked what I was doing there. I stuttered something about being bored. He waved it off. Kids always poking around, and told me to be careful at night. There was that laugh again, shorter, like someone who'd found amusement in a harmless prank. He closed the door behind me, and that was that. I left feeling like a jerk for intruding, and like a movie extra for a story I hadn't earned. Later that night, when the house had sunk to that late-hour hush, something slammed inside our place. It wasn't a polite knock. It wasn't the sound of the waves. It was a hard, living crash that punched the quiet and left a smell of adrenaline in the throat. I froze because there's a cement slab moment where your brain decides if you're in a movie or not. Jake, bless him, slept through a tornado. My dad slept like an economy of worry. I sat up in the narrow bed and heard a chair, not ours, fall over in the hallway, then the scuff of a shoe on the stairs. My heart kept thinking prank, because teenagers don't always have better imagination than danger. I did what a lot of dumb teenagers do. I went to the door and propped a wooden chair under the knob, like some ridiculous lock from a bad thriller. It made me feel in control, which was probably the whole point. I sat cross-legged on the bed with the phone under my pillow, staring at the door as if sheer will could keep it closed. There was this long minute where I could hear the house breathe. Then there was the sound of something heavy being placed on the other side of the door, like someone testing its weight. My palms sweated through the denim. Time became a thing you leaned against, trying not to make noise. At some point, footsteps moved away from our door and down the hall toward the back of the house. I did the math. Tall, long stride, not a kid. I heard the creak of the back door opening, then the screen door. I remember the soft snap the screen made when it shut, like a soft click of a trap. The next thing that really cemented what was happening was the appearance of a backpack. It wasn't ours. It was a dark, cheap canvas pack that looked like it had been hurriedly filled with whatever someone thought they could carry off. I saw it through the slatted light of the screened porch, abandoned as if the person who left it planned to do something and then changed their mind. I didn't call out. I didn't call 911. I did what my fear allowed. I slid down the porch steps onto the gravel and hugged the latticework, feeling the grit of it bite the skin of my palms. I had stayed behind because I wanted to send a text. Now I was hiding like a kid who'd swallowed something he wasn't supposed to. I can't explain the logic. There wasn't one. From the porch, the night sounded different. The ocean was a dull, steady exhale. The trees whispered, and somewhere down the road an engine idled like it didn't know what to do with itself. Morning came on a Sunday that felt too bright for everything that had happened. After a perfunctory breakfast, Hugh walked over with a face that didn't expect anyone to be awake. He'd been restless. He told us he had cameras in his hallway. Cameras. Small, looped, nothing sophisticated. The kind people get to keep an eye on porches and dogs. Hugh's expression shifted when he checked the footage. He was quiet the way an old man is quiet when he remembers a sacred thing wrong. He showed my dad the tape, and I watched from the doorway like someone watching a slow car crash in a rental compact. On the footage you could see the hallway, the light catching the dust like a second film. The camera caught a silhouette, then the tilt of shoulders, a head that was too bald under the overhead lamp. The man in the grainy pixels moved without apology, like someone used to walking through other people's houses. He came out of our bedroom carrying a backpack, walking with the calm of someone who'd checked the space and made it his for a moment. Then, in the footage, about a minute later, the same figure walks back through the door and disappears into the darker parts of the house. I watched it and felt like my skin had been thin-papered over a memory I could now read through. The police came. They were kind, or at least professional, and they did the things police do. They looked in the woods, took statements, asked questions a dozen different ways to try and find a hole in our stories they could use. They found footprints leading away from the back porch into the scrub, but the footprints wove into the woods where the path was muddied and confused. Dogs tracked and then lost the scent. We spent that day packing the kind of things you shove into suitcases to make it look like you're not running. My parents were an efficient hurricane of decision-making. I was just a kid being told what to do. No one ever found that tall, bald man. We had footage of him walking through our bedroom and out again, the kind of damning, helpless evidence that proves a thing happened without ever offering who did it. The police told us they'd searched the area, asked neighbors. They'd follow up if anything turned up. Months went by and nothing. Hugh swore he'd checked his cameras regularly after that, tightened the locks on his little house and kept an eye out. I moved through that summer with a new stiffness to my shoulders. My dad turned the back porch into a fortress of caution. Deadbolts, a new lock, an extra chair for the door that felt less like a joke and more like a symbol. We moved on because life makes you move on. But the guilty part is that I moved easier than Jake. I knew and still know that I could have been braver. I could have woken someone up, called the police then and there, or not gone into Hugh's house at all. Not every lesson is dramatic. Some are dull and nagging. Don't be the person alone in the house at night because you think you can handle all of it. If that was the first cut, the second story was the bruise that stayed purple for years. It happened in West Palm Beach a couple of summers later. This time I wasn't 18 anymore. I was the age where you think you're grown because you can rent a car and fold your clothes without looking like someone threw them into a bag. My cousin Will and I had been friends since forever, and our mutual cousin Teresa, she was the one everybody called for plans because she made them feel like an adventure. We were on that trip that feels like a montage in a movie. Daytime beach, fake tans, nights that blurred neon lights and sticky drinks. Will had this habit of pitching himself into anything that looked fun, but the night we went out, he was drinking faster than he was thinking. The parking lot at the club smelled like salt and gasoline and someone else's cigarettes. We laughed, because that's what you do when you're not ready to be afraid. At some point, Will wandered off. He was good at wandering, it was almost a talent. At first we thought he'd gone to the bathroom, then to the car to sleep it off, then to get food. It got later. The music thinned, and we realized Will hadn't come back. Teresa and I went looking, which is to say we stumbled into the dark, the kind of dark that isn't just absence of light, but a thing that rearranges your balance. The path to the swamp was battered with the footprints of last week's storms. The road trickled into marsh grass that looked black in the lamplight. We called his name, louder the closer we got to the mangroves. The swamp smelled like old rain, like vegetation that had forgotten it was supposed to be pretty. We were joking in our heads to stay calm, then whispering his name like it was a talisman. Then the scream hit, not human in the way a shout is human, but high and sudden and full of a thing that made the air feel thinner. It ripped out of the swamp like it had been hiding and then shoved all of us into the present. It wasn't Will. It didn't sound like Will, it sounded like a person but altered, like someone's throat had tried to sing a sound it didn't have permission to make. The sound stopped as quickly as it started. One long, catastrophic note, and then nothing. For a full 2 seconds we were convinced someone had actually been hurt. Maybe I'd be braver a different way and say we were ready to help. The truth is that we froze. Teresa clutched my arm, and I could feel the smallness of our bodies against the dark. We called Will's name until our voices ran out. The swamp answered with crickets and the wet, soft slap of water against reeds. We traced the edge of the marsh with flashlights, beams trembling over roots and small glassy pools. The mud was thick and pulled at our shoes. At one point my foot sank, and I nearly lost balance, the mud sucking at my ankle like it wanted to keep what touched it. We moved deeper, stepping on thin bridges of grass, following boot prints that narrowed into a path we could barely see. By morning, the sun made everything reveal its true shape. The night has a way of forgiving the things it hides. What daylight did was show us evidence instead of shadows. We found a denim sleeve snagged on a low branch, frayed like it had been ripped rather than torn cleanly. Nearby lay a jacket, folded in the way people fold something they mean to come back for. There were footprints in a clustered pattern, not like the single wandering prints of someone who got lost, but like a group of prints that had moved together and then separated. The muddy prints looked heavier in places where steps had been more forceful, as if someone had been planting their weight down to keep balance. We debated calling the police for an embarrassingly long time. There was this mix of shame and fear that told us we were overreacting, that Will had just passed out in some ditch, and we'd make the officers come out, and lights would flash, and we'd have to explain why we were screaming into marsh grass at midnight. Teresa wanted to call. She was the reasonable one, the one whose mom had always told us, do the practical thing. I wanted to say it was fine because part of my brain was still a teenager who thought I could handle everything with a joke. Will finally turned up, sweaty and disheveled, after we'd been searching for an hour. He claimed he'd wandered, found a shady spot and slept. He couldn't remember the scream. Maybe he had been somewhere else entirely. Maybe he was right. We convinced ourselves the denim sleeve could have come from a fisherman's jacket, or from someone else who'd had a worse night than we did. But the jacket, folded wrong, and the clustered footprints didn't fit into that neat relief. You don't fold a jacket that way unless you plan to come back. And even if Will had just wandered off, what made that scream? The memory of that sound lives in me, the way a scar lives, not visible but twitchy when weather changes. Later, when I tell the story around a campfire or in a bar, people lean in because there's a visceral part of us that likes to be haunted without being truly threatened. But the thing that kept me wide awake for weeks wasn't the thought that something had happened to Will in the swamp. It was the idea that something unknown could make that sound, and then stop, and we would have no proof the thing had even existed except for a jacket and a sleeve and my insufficient bravery. We argued about it for a long weekend, and then we agreed, ugly and soft, to drop it. I remember the way Teresa looked at me when we walked back to the car, like she wanted to pin me to the spot for being a coward, and also like she understood because she was tired of being brave for other people too. We left with more sunburn and fewer answers, and the swamp became a place in my head that made night noises into big things. I told myself that some mysteries are like bad TV. You don't have to finish the season. But I still play that scream in the back of my head when the dark is thick and something in the house bangs like a falling chair. If you think that's scary, wait until you hear what happened in Ocean City. That one is a strange sort of violation that isn't dramatic in the way movies make sense of things. It's quieter, weirder, and it left me staring at my own openness towards strangers. But before I get to that, I want to sit with the two things that both these stories have in common: the small, stupid choices that open doors, the decision to stay up too late, to wander next door, to laugh at a neighbor's oddness, and the way normal gets rewritten after a single event. You don't feel different until you do. You don't notice the new caution until your fingers check a doorknob on autopilot. I should say something about how memory plays into these stories. When you tell a thing enough, it becomes shaped by the telling. You polish the edges, sharpen the spook, forget the awkward parts. The details I remember are the important ones: the backpack on the porch, the footage of the bald man in the hallway, the scream that fit into the swamp like a missing puzzle piece, the denim sleeve on a branch. Those are things that don't change whether I tell them sober at breakfast or drunk at midnight. But how I felt in those moments, furious at myself, childish, numb, guilty, that folds in and out of the narrative the way light folds into a room. I was not a hero, I was not particularly wise. Mostly I was someone fumbling around in the dark and trying to make sense of what happened after. When I left West Palm, there was a hollow place in me I didn't have words for. It's like packing a suitcase you never get to unpack. You carry the heaviness with you, and it gets in the way on other trips. The main thing had taught me that strangers can go through your home like they're passing through an exhibit. The swamp had taught me that some sounds are warnings, and some are evidence of things you might never prove. Ocean City would teach me that not everything that opens the door will take something obvious. Sometimes violation is intentional and tiny, and prefers to unsettle rather than attack. And then the gas station moment in Ocean City happened, that small fussy something that I didn't think much of at the time, until our room was turned inside out, and the person who greeted us with a smile had a name that didn't stick. But that's a whole other kind of story, quieter, almost polite, then invasive in a way that makes you question every interaction you didn't read right. I can still see the fluorescent buzz of the gas station, the guy leaning against the pump like he belonged there, and the way Vanessa tightened her hand around mine on the walk back to the condo like she was corralling a thing she didn't want to lose. I can tell you this much before I get into the details. With Ocean City, it wasn't about a scream or a camera clip. It was about a pattern. People showing up at the same place wearing the same clothes 2 days in a row, a knock at 1 in the morning that made us deaf with adrenaline, and then the realization that some photos and small things were missing. Vanessa cried in the parking lot. The police came. We filed statements. And still, we were left with the feeling of someone watching the outside of our lives and treating it with a gentle, predatory curiosity. But I'm getting ahead of myself. There are details in that story I need to set up first. The way we met Henry at the pump, how he managed to seem harmless and creepy at the same time, and how Sarah, pale, sun-avoidant, didn't fit into the summer like she should have. I remember thinking at the time that the whole thing had a movie-quality momentum. You meet someone, you let them into conversation, then they appear again, and the appearance becomes a string of notes that form a tune you can't stop humming. It's only later that you realize the tune has a minor key. For now, though, what I want to leave you with before I keep going is this. Vacations do this strange thing where they lower your guard. You're outside your routines, trusting hotels and rental agreements, and the fictional kindness of strangers. You treat the world like it owes you a good story, and sometimes it gives you one, but not the kind with a neat ending. Sometimes it gives you a bruise you keep picking at because you want it to tell you something useful, If you're still with me, stick around. The next part gets into how a knock at midnight can rearrange what you think of as safety, and why I still check the balcony when I sleep in a new place. But for now, the main house sits white with its green shutters in my memory. Hugh's laugh hangs in the air like a question mark, and the swamp keeps making noises when the wind is right. These are the things that remind you that sometimes the most disturbing vacation experiences aren't dramatic in the moment. They're the ones that leave you with a smaller version of yourself the next morning. Ocean City was quieter than any of the brochures made it sound. The boardwalk had that sticky, sweet smell of fried dough and sunscreen, but once you walked a block inland toward the rental condos, the noise softened to a distant carnival hum, and the world felt smaller, like you could reach out and touch the ocean if you wanted to, but you didn't have to. Vanessa and I had driven down for a long weekend, a break that felt like a necessity rather than a luxury. She had been working too much. I had been doing the emotional labor of not asking too many questions. We checked into a small third-floor unit that looked out over the beach. The balcony door had a thin strip of weathered paint from where someone had leaned on it for years. That night we ate cheap seafood and walked barefoot on the boards, and the whole thing felt ordinary and not worth worrying about. We met Henry at a gas station on the way in. That detail always sits in my mind like a mustard stain you can't rub out. There he was, leaning on the pump with that measured confidence some people have, like it's a chore to be charming. He had a laugh that landed in his mouth before he spoke, and he asked for the time like he expected you to be glad to tell him. Vanessa joked with him about how absurdly specific our directions were. Turn at the third seagull, go left where the palm tree looks like it's waving, and he smiled like he knew the town in a way that made us feel we were meeting an old friend rather than a stranger. He said his name like a brand, Henry. He told a little story about living down the shore and leaving out an odd detail about his work that made him sound like a local who'd chosen to stay. He introduced a woman beside him, Sarah, who stuck to the shadow of the gas station awning like she was allergic to the sun. Pale, sunglasses at night, hair tucked into a cap. She didn't say much. They left with a friendly wave. We made the usual brief assumptions, that they'd be around, that we'd run into them again maybe. The way you tell yourself a stranger's smile is harmless. 2 days later they were at the beach again. Same outfits. Same laugh from Henry when he joked with a couple of guys about volleyball. It sounds small until you realize how like a pattern it feels. People dressed the same way in the same place on different days, like extras in a movie who refuse to leave. Vanessa noticed it first, the little tilt of recognition on her face as we passed by their spot. "Do you remember them from the gas station?" she asked. And I remember thinking it was cute that she kept track of strangers. She was always more tuned into the room than I was, like she could read a place and know whether it would be a good night. She pointed them out and said, "They're here again." I waved like it was nothing, and she held my hand a little firmer. You tell yourself anything to make a feeling less heavy. You say maybe they just like this beach, or maybe it's a small town and they live here. You wrap yourself in explanations because the unknown feels huge and cold. That night we had dinner, talked about nothing important, and walked back to the condo with sand in our shoes and a soundtrack of gulls and a radio somewhere, playing a song we half remembered. We locked the door and fell asleep like the world had finished its work for us. The kind of sleep you get when exhaustion outmuscles curiosity. Sometime after midnight, which is the hour when normal people stop moving with intention and start moving with habit, there was a knock. Not a single clean knock, but a delicate, measured rapping that sounded as if someone knew how to make it sound casual, like a neighbor asking for sugar. At first I thought it was another guest, someone who had come back late, someone who would fumble with keys and curse and then laugh at themselves. We lived in a building where doors stuck and people fumbled with locks. The first knock had that inconveniently friendly cadence. Vanessa was awake before I was. She heard it and sat up, the lamp creating a small circle of light in the room like a public confession. "Someone at the door," she whispered, as if saying it softly would make it less real. I moved with the lazy logic of someone who knows how to hold on to hours of sleep with both hands. Maybe it was the wrong room number. Maybe it was a neighbor with a story. The knock came again, more insistent but still careful, the kind of knock that didn't want to scare but intended to be noticed. I went to the door and peered through the peephole. The hall light bled in and made everything a little too ordinary to be dangerous. There was no silhouette, just a sliver of hallway and the vague impression of movement. I listened, my breath a small drum in my chest. I could have said we were leaving, opened the door, or shouted something to scare them off. Instead, I turned the deadbolt and told Vanessa to stay where she was. She curled under the blanket like a child and squeezed my hand until it went numb. The knocking stopped. The world outside resumed its static hum. I told myself it was over. I told Vanessa it was nothing, a late-night wanderer. She let out a shaky laugh and said she was fine. Then she whispered that she wasn't. I went back to bed, but not in the same way. I lay there like a person who had been told the layout of a trap, and every shadow was now a possible hinge. We kept the balcony door closed. We both sat up, 2 islands in a shared boat, each watching the other to see if we could be brave for them. The next morning, Vanessa found her favorite bathing suit missing. It wasn't expensive. It was one of those bright patterned ones she'd gotten at a sale. But she kept it for how it fit, for how it made her feel the way she liked to feel, easy and unapologetic in a world that often insisted on more clothes. The suitcase had been searched through, not in the frenzied way of a burglar looking for valuables, but like someone rifling for small things that meant something to us. A pair of sandals that had been left by the door were gone, and a printed photo of us, one of those old paper prints where the colors lean a little toward nostalgia, was missing from the top of the dresser. The way the drawer was pulled out halfways, the way the closet looked like someone had checked the pockets of a jacket and then decided that what they wanted wasn't there, felt personal. At first I blamed myself because that is reflexive. You always find the most effective place to put blame is on yourself. After all, you left the window unlocked, you left your bag unattended, you met people at a pump and let them into conversation. The police arrived in a small, efficient way. 1 cruiser, 2 officers who wore their suspicion like a second uniform and asked standard questions with blank expression. We told them about Henry and Sarah. We told them about the gas station, the way Henry had leaned against the pump and how Sarah had stayed under the shadow. We told them about the repeated appearances at the beach, the knock at night, the missing bathing suit, the sandals, the photo. They wrote everything down as if taking inventory of a house they had never been inside. Vanessa sat and let herself cry in the lobby of the building, where the manager had tried to be helpful, but mostly offered platitudes that mattered less than a holding hand. At some point she said, through hiccups, "I felt like someone had been in my life." That's the language of violation that isn't bloodied. It's the thing that makes mornings slower and coffee taste like ash. The officer who had been asking questions looked at me like he expected me to do more than hand over a statement. Maybe he wanted me to be angry, to have a plan. Maybe he wanted answers I didn't have. They checked the building's CCTV for the previous days. The camera at the end of our hall was grainy, captured at a low frame rate that turned people into slow ghosts. There were clips of someone on the balcony below ours in the afternoon, someone who seemed to be looking up, who scanned the floors and then left. There were repeat clips of movement on the boardwalk in front of the complex at odd hours, but there was no definitive film of a person taking our things, no clear image of fingernails unhooking a photo from a dresser top. Henry's phone number, which he had given in a strangely casual moment when we traded small talk at the beach, went straight to a mechanical voice when the officer called. It was out of service. It responded to texts before the trip and then stopped. When we tried the address Henry had mentioned, the property was either wrong or misreported. There was a house that fit part of his description, but the neighbor swore they had no idea who Henry and Sarah were. You learn quickly that there is a difference between an offense you can name and one you can't. Someone stealing a necklace makes a case with receipts. Someone removing your things like tokens leaves a kind of vandalism that isn't worth insurance. The police were frank in a way that is merciful and cruel at the same time. "We'll keep checking," they said, which means they'll file the report and hope something else brings them to the conclusion they want. In practice, it means they won't likely expend the manpower for a pair of sandals and a bathing suit, unless they find something that makes it feel like more. We spent the rest of that weekend with a new choreography. Vanessa slept with the light on. I waited up to make sure she fell asleep. Every knock made my heart flip toward the ceiling. I checked the balcony every time I went outside, even if it was to throw out a bag of trash. On the last night, I climbed the stairs to the roof alone and stood above the building, the ocean a dark mirror 2 blocks away, and felt like the universe had shrunk to the size of the balcony door. That closeness made me angry at myself for being naive, and angrier at the world for having people like Henry and Sarah in it. People who could move through the world in a way that left footprints only if you were close enough or unlucky enough to see them. After we flew home, we filed a police report and then filed the kind of silence that follows a thing that's been touched, but not broken. We never found Henry or Sarah. Their faces lived in my head as partial sketches. Henry's smile, Sarah's guarded stillness. Months later, when I heard from other friends about catcalls and stolen wallets and near misses, I felt the stitch of gratitude and shame, grateful nothing worse had happened, ashamed that we had let someone get so close without seeing the red flags. I told myself it was a theft, a thing with a material list. Vanessa told me it was stalking in a soft, shaky voice, and both of those things could be true. The truth I lived with was that our privacy had been invaded, and the person who had done it had not been caught. That unresolved detail sits like a stone in my shoe. It hurts each step, but not enough to stop me from walking. There are nights where the past squeezes its hand into my present. When a delivery knocks at my door, I check who it is before I answer. When I leave a bag on a cafe chair, I notice and leash it to me with my foot. Vanessa and I have had conversations about boundaries we didn't have before, about who we tell where we're staying, about whether to post live updates from a rental condo, about whether it's okay to smile at strangers. Some of these are simple, functional things. Some are the slower, more bitter lessons you find after you realize the world kept the same script, while one page in your own copy had been rewritten. The 3 stories, Maine, West Palm, Ocean City, are different kinds of wrong. The Maine incident was physical in the most immediate filmic sense: a camera, a silhouette, an intruder walking through your bedroom like he was reading a brochure. The West Palm scream is the stuff of possibility, an unknown noise that could be nothing, could be everything, and you are left with a jacket and prints as if someone had removed a scene from a play. Ocean City is smaller scale in material, but larger scale in the way it reaches under your skin. The theft of small items felt like a theft of feeling, a quiet removal that left a puddle of mistrust. All 3 taught me things I didn't expect to learn. I learned that curiosity is a muscle that can be used for bad things as well as good ones. I learned that groups of people can opt for fiction over help, because the social cost of being wrong feels heavier than the moral cost of inaction. I learned how your sense of safety can be rearranged by 3 nights in 3 different places, and that rearrangement doesn't always go back to the original blueprint. There are smaller, dumber personal confessions I have to make too, because confession is a way to be honest about your own complicity. I stayed behind in Maine to text my girlfriend because I valued a conversation more than being with my family that day. I let a drunken friend wander into the swamp instead of tethering him to our group. I smiled at a man at a gas station because I thought smiling was the price of being polite. These are not excuses. They're explanations, and they sit with me like an inventory of choices I would change if I had a backwards clock. The aftermath of all this isn't dramatic. There was no courtroom, no viral posts, no heroics that cleaned the slate. Instead, there was a reshaping of habits. I learned to check locks twice and to say the names of strangers out loud when they introduced themselves so I could remember them better. Vanessa learned to trust a feeling that didn't have a name, and to tell me when something was off instead of assuming I'd notice. We are better travelers now in the small, practical sense. We lock windows, even if the latch seems fine. We keep our bags zipped. We don't leave prints, literal and metaphorical, where they can be taken. But there's a cost you can't name on a packing list, the knowledge that the world contains people who will step across a threshold and treat it like permission. The cost is the way your hand reaches for a light switch in a hotel room before you turn a key, the way you notice exits, the way the ocean can suddenly sound like a place where things vanish. Vacations change you sometimes by adding a restful story to your memory, and sometimes by adding a bruise you keep fingering to see if it still hurts. The most disturbing experiences I've had weren't the ones you'd find in a true crime montage with a neat police wrap-up. They were small, intimate, and unresolved. the kinds of scenes that fit into the margins of your life and make you read them twice. I've told these 3 stories a lot now. Sometimes people nod and say the right things. Sometimes they tell their own versions, of a door ajar, of a knock at midnight, of a scream in the dark. And I realize this pattern repeats more than anyone wants to admit. We're all narrating our little misfortunes into something that sounds like a lesson. Maybe the lesson is blunt. Be careful. Maybe the lesson is more complicated. Be kind but not blind. Be brave but not reckless. Notice what feels odd and trust it. I can't give you a checklist that will keep you safe. I can only tell you that once your sense of safety changes, it doesn't always go back. Sometimes it becomes a filter you carry with you, which is useful and also heavy. If there's an uncomfortable but honest ending to these stories, it's that life is rarely tidy. We live in rooms that strangers can enter, in parks that hold things we don't want to see, in boardwalks that hum along oblivious to what waits behind a knocked door. These vacations left me with a map of small anxieties and one big practical gratitude, that none of us were physically murdered, that at worst we had things taken, and at best we learned to notice. Gratitude doesn't erase fear. It sits next to it and sometimes argues with it. You might be thinking about the people in these stories now. The tall, bald man in Maine captured on a neighbor's camera, the muffled howl of a scream in a Florida swamp, Henry and Sarah's quiet invasions in Ocean City. You might be thinking about small choices you made on a trip and the times you shrugged off an uneasy feeling. I did that too. I learned the hard way that the world doesn't always deliver a tidy plotline where wrongs are fixed and lessons feel dramatic. Mostly it hands you details and leaves you to assemble them into something useful. If these stories hit you the way they hit me, sharp and a little raw, then there's one practical thing I actually want from you. Share your own vacation moments in the comments. The small things that made you look over your shoulder. The nights you shouldn't have been alone, the times you wish you had done something different. Not to compete in a misery Olympics, but because telling these stories is how we notice patterns and maybe keep each other a little safer. If you found this worth your time, like or share the video so others who love unsettling travel stories can hear it too. And if you want more, subscribe. There are more uncomfortable truths and strange trips I promise to tell. I still check balcony doors in new places. I still fold my clothes differently when I pack, into layers that make sense for escape as well as comfort. I still hear the swamp sometimes when the night is too quiet. Experiences like these don't vanish. They collect like shells until you unpack them and sort them out. They become part of your travel kit, a little more caution, a sharper ear for knocks that feel rehearsed, the humility to admit you weren't as brave as you could have been. Most people go on vacation to forget. Sometimes what happens on vacation refuses to be forgotten. It plants itself in you, small at first, then larger with each retelling. These 3 moments, Maine, West Palm, Ocean City, are the ones that did that to me. They altered the way I look at doors and strangers and the gentle chorus of a beach town at night. They added a hedge of wariness around places I used to trust without thinking. If you have a story like one of these, something that made you look over your shoulder or pulled the rug from under a holiday, write it below. I read as many as I can, and sometimes your stories are the ones that teach me the next thing I need to know. Thanks for listening, and for letting a stranger on the internet tell you about the worst parts of what I thought would be summers I'd only remember for sunshine.